Welcome to Module 301, Lesson 1, the Intensity-Duration Relationship. I'm Ayla.
I'm Emily, and we are your MyZone Master Trainers.
We're going to start out by talking about how intensity and duration are related. There's an inverse relationship between exercise intensity and duration, meaning as one goes up, the other should come down. The lower the intensity of your activity, the longer you should be able to sustain it. The higher the intensity of your activity, the shorter you will be able to sustain it. And of course, there's training effects involved in that. The fitter you become, the longer you're able to sustain higher intensities. Some examples of higher intensity activities that are shorter in duration, or should be, are Olympic lifting, or if you're sprinting on a track, or doing some high intensity interval training. And then some examples of lower intensity activity that would be longer in duration would be long, slow distance running, or maybe a recovery cycling ride. Exercise frequency and duration are determined by the intensity that's required to meet your client's goals. So whatever your client's goals are, that should dictate the programming that you use for frequency and duration. And of course, it's also going to depend on the time and the energy that your client has to dedicate to their exercise program.
Absolutely. And when we talk about metabolism in relation to exercise, we can really think about aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. But we have to remember that they're both working at the same time. One system isn't turning off while the other one turns on. Right. Yeah. And so intensity and duration of exercise will dictate to what degree you're using anaerobic, meaning without oxygen, versus aerobic, meaning with oxygen, to produce ATP, your cell's energy. When we do talk about these types of aerobic versus anaerobic metabolism, keep in mind what type of exercise is primarily associated with anaerobic versus aerobic. The higher intensity, shorter duration exercises rely more heavily on anaerobic metabolism, while the longer duration, less intense exercise relies more on aerobic metabolism.
Let's talk about how we can measure cardiorespiratory intensity. There are many different ways that we could do this. We can use the MyZone system to monitor heart rate, we can use the talk test, or we can use rate of perceived exertion as just a few examples. The talk test we've alluded to a few times in the other lessons. The lower the intensity, the more words they should be able to say at a time before needing to take a breath. Usually a fluid sentence or two at lower or moderate intensity. And then as you get up into the higher intensity, the yellows, the reds, your clients really should only be able to say a word or two at a time. And if they're really pushing up into red, they should barely be able to speak at all.
You can also use rate of perceived exertion, or RPE. We've already talked about this in the assessments that we showed you previously in Module 201, but RPE is your rate of perceived exertion, how you feel during exercise. We use a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being rest, just hanging out, 10 being really, really, really intense max effort exercise. So as that exercise intensity increases, your client should report a higher rate of perceived exertion. 1 through 5 are pretty, laid back, light intensity exercise. Once we get up into 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then we're starting to get more into moderate to high intensity exercise. So keep an eye on that with your client.
Let's define the World Health Organization and American College of Sports Medicine physical activity guidelines. They recommend that to maintain healthy levels as adults, we accumulate 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise during the week. That would be 30 minutes, 5 days a week. Think blue and green zones when you think about moderate intensity. Or you can be accumulating 75 minutes per week of vigorous intensity exercise. That'd be about 25 minutes a day for 3 days a week. And those zones would be the yellow and the red zones. The higher the intensity, the lower the recommended amount of time. That's the intensity-duration relationship. If you have a client that has time constraints, they can be accumulating those recommendations in as little as 10 minutes at a time. So encourage them to incorporate it throughout the day, and that way they can achieve the minimum recommended amount. And that relates to the MyZone status we were talking about before. If you accumulate the minimum recommended physical activity guidelines, 1,300 MEPs per month, you move up in your status.
What's so cool about MyZone is that they use the recommended guidelines from ACSM and the World Health Organizations, and they reward you based on those. So as Ayla just mentioned, if you earn 1,300 MyZone effort points per month, then you know you've met those guidelines. That would equate to about 300 MyZone effort points per week. And then if your client is going to be working more in the yellow and the red zones for higher intensity exercise, then they won't need to spend as much time per session working out to accumulate those goals that we just mentioned. Thank you guys so much for joining us for Module 301, Lesson 1.